Eiríkr Hákonarson. Eiríkr Hákonarson, Old Norse. Eiríkr Hákonarson, 960s–1020s, was Earl of Lade, governor of Norway and Earl of Northumbria. He was the son of Earl Hákon Sigurðarson and brother of the legendary Haakonsdottir of Lade. He participated in the Battle of Hjörungavágr, the Battle of Svolder, and the Conquest of England by King Canute the Great. Name: Eirík is referred to in various ways in the medieval sources and by modern scholars. He most commonly witnessed charters as Eirik Dux Duke Eirik, but his name is also spelled Eirik, Eirik or Eric in 11th century Latin and Old English sources. In Old Norse sources using normalized orthography, he is most commonly Eiríkr Jarl Earl Eric or Eiríkr Jarl Hákonarson, but sometimes as Eiríkr. Modern historians usually use a variant of Eiríkr/Eirik/Eric and his patronym Hákonarson/Hákonarson/Hákonsson, meaning son of Hákon. In modern Norwegian, it would be Eirík Hákonsson. Some English works prefer Eric of Hlathir, referring to his Norse earldom, or Eric of Norway. Early life. Principal sources on Eric's youth are Faggiskina and Heimskringla. They relate that Eric was the son of Hákon Sigurðarson and a woman of low birth whom Hákon bedded during a sojourn in Uppland. Hákon cared little for the boy and gave him to a friend of his to raise. On one occasion, when Eric was 11 or 12 years old, he and his foster father had harbored their ship right next to Earl Hákon. Then, Hákon's closest friend, Skapti, arrived and asked Eric to move away so that he could harbor next to Hákon as he was used to. When Eric refused, Hákon was infuriated by the boy's pride and sternly ordered him away. Humiliated, Eric had no choice but to obey. In the following winter, he avenged the humiliation by chasing down Skapti's ship and killing him. This was Eric's first exploit, as commemorated by his skald Eyjolfur Dadaskald, who mentions the incident in his Bandadrapa. The sagas say that after killing Skapti, Eric sailed south to Denmark, where he was received by King Harald Bluetooth. After a winter's stay in Denmark, Harald granted Eric earldom over Romerike and Vingulmark areas in the south of Norway long under Danish influence. In Heimskringla, this information is supported with a somewhat vague verse from Bandadrapa. Battle of Hjörungavágr. The Battle of Hjörungavágr was Eric's first major confrontation. The battle was fought at sea, between the Earls of Lade and a Danish invasion fleet. The battle is described in the Norse kings' sagas such as Heimskringla as well as in Jomsvikinga saga and Saxo Grammaticus Gesta Danorum. Those late literary accounts are fanciful, but historians believe that they contain a kernel of truth. Some contemporary skaldic poetry alludes to the battle, including verses by Thordr Kolbeinsson and Tindr Hallkelsson. Hákon Sigurðarson was a strong believer in the Old Norse gods, and when King Harald Bluetooth attempted to force Christianity upon him, Hákon broke his allegiance to Denmark. A Danish invasion force was defeated at the Battle of Hjörungavágr in 986. According to Heimskringla, Eric, apparently reconciled with his father, commanded 60 ships in the battle and emerged victorious. After the battle, he gave quarter to many of the Jomsvikings, including Van Akasson. Exile. In 995, as Olafur Tryggvason seized power as King of Norway, Eric was forced into exile in Sweden. He allied himself with King Olaf of Sweden and King Sweyn, whose daughter Gyda he married. Using Sweden as his base, he launched a series of raiding expeditions into the east. Harrying the lands of King Vladimir I of Kiev, Eric looted and burned down the town of Staria Ladoga, Old Norse Aldagia. There are no written continental sources to confirm or refute this, but in the 1980s, Soviet archaeologists unearthed evidence which showed a burning of Ladoga in the late 10th century. Eiríkr also plundered in western Estonia on Adalcisla and the island of Saaremaa on Icisla. According to the Faggiskina summary of Bandadrapa, he fought Vikings in the Baltic and raided Östergötland during the same time. Battle of Svolder. In the Battle of Svolder in 1000, Eiríkr, Sweyn, and Olaf ambushed King Olafr Tryggvason by the island of Svolder. The place cannot now be identified, as the formation of the Baltic coast has been much modified in the course of subsequent centuries. Svolder was an island probably on the North German coast, near Rügen. During the summer, King Olaf had been in the eastern Baltic. The allies lay in wait for him at the island of Svolder on his way home. The Norwegian king had with him 71 vessels, but part of them belonged to an associate, Jarl Sigvaldi, a chief of the Jomsvikings, who was an agent of his enemies and who deserted him. Olaf's own ships went past the anchorage of Eiríkr and his allies in a long column without order, as no attack was expected. The king was in the rear of the whole of his best vessels. The allies allowed the bulk of the Norwegian ships to pass, and then stood out to attack Olaf. Olaf refused to flee and turned to give battle with the 11 ships immediately about him. The disposition adopted was one which is found recurring in many sea fights of the Middle Ages, where a fleet had to fight on the defensive. Olaf lashed his ships side to side, his own, the Long Serpent, the finest war vessel as yet built in the north, being in the middle of the line, where her bows projected beyond the others. The advantage of this arrangement was that it left all hands free to fight. A barrier could be formed with the oars and yards, and the enemy's chance of making use of his superior numbers to attack on both sides would be, as far as possible, limited a great point when all fighting was with the sword, or with such feeble missile weapons as bows and javelins. Olaf, in fact, turned his 11 ships into a floating fort. Norse writers, who are the main authorities, gave all the credit to the Norwegians, and according to them all the intelligence of Olaf's enemies and most of their valor were to be found in Eiríkr. They say that the Danes and Swedes rushed at the front of Olaf's line without success. Eiríkr attacked the flank. His vessel, the Iron Ram on Jarnbarden, was bearded, that is to say, strengthened across the bows by bands of iron, and he forced her between the last but one of Olaf's line. In this way the Norwegian ships were carried one by one, till the Long Serpent alone was left. At last she too was overpowered. Olaf leapt into the sea holding his shield edgeways, so that he sank at once, and the weight of his hauberk dragged him down. Eiríkr captured Olaf's ship, the Long Serpent, and steered it from the battle, an event dwelled upon by his court poet Halldor Akristni. Rule of Norway. After the Battle of Svalder, together with his brother Svein Hákonarson, Eiríkr became governor of Norway under Sweyn Forkbeard from 1000 to 1012. Eirik's son, Hákon Eiríksson, continued in this position until 1015. Eiríkr and Svein consolidated their rule by marrying their sister Bergljot to Einar Thambar Skelfir, gaining a valuable advisor and ally. Faggiskina relates that there was good peace at this time and very prosperous seasons. The Jarls maintained the laws well and were stern in punishing offences. During his rule of Norway, Eirik's only serious rival was Erlingur Skjalgsson. Too powerful and cautious to touch but not powerful enough to seek open confrontation, he maintained an uneasy peace and alliance with the earls throughout their rule. According to Gretti's saga, Eiríkr forbade duelling by law and exiled berserks shortly before his expedition to England. Conquest of England. In 1014 or 1015 Eirík left Norway and joined Canute the Great for his campaign in England. Judging from Thordr Kolbeinson's Eiríksdrap of their fleets met off the English coast in 1015, but the chronology of the various sources is difficult to reconcile, and some scholars prefer placing their meeting in 1014 in Denmark. At that time Canute was young and inexperienced, but Eirík was an experienced warrior of tested intelligence and fortune. Fagiskinna and the opinion of Frank Stenton, the best adviser that could have been found for a young prince setting out on a career of conquest. The Scandinavian invasion fleet landed at Sandwich in midsummer 1015, where it met little resistance. Canute's forces moved into Wessex and plundered in Dorset, Wiltshire, and Somerset. Alderman Eiríkr Striona assembled an English force of 40 ships and submitted to Canute. The Encomium Emmi is the only English source which gives any information on Eirik's actions at this time, but its account of his supposed independent raids is vague and does not fit well with other sources. In early 1016, the Scandinavian army moved over the Thames into Mercia, plundering as it went. Prince Edmund attempted to muster an army to resist the invasion, but his efforts were not successful, and Canute's forces continued unhindered into Northumbria, where Uhtred the Bold of Northumbria was murdered. The great North English earldom was given by Canute to Eirík after he had won control of the north. After conquering Northumbria, the invading army turned south again towards London. Before they arrived, King Ethelred the Unready died on April 23, and Edmund Ironside was chosen king. Following Ethelred's death, according to the Encomium Emmi, the siege was overseen by Eirík, and this may well be accurate. The legendary saga of Saint Olaf indicates that Eirík was present at the siege of London, and a verse by Thordr says that Eirík fought west of London with Ulfsitil Snillingur. After several battles, Canute and Edmund reached an agreement to divide the kingdom, but Edmund died a few months later. By 1017, Canute was undisputed king of all England. He divided the kingdom into 4 parts. Wessex he kept for himself. He gave Northumbria to Eirík, East Anglia to Thorkel the Tall, and Mercia to Eiríkr Striona. Later the same year Canute had Eirík executed as a traitor. According to the Encomium Emmi, he ordered Eirík to pay this man what we owe him, and he chopped off his head with his axe. Eirík remained as Earl of Northumbria until his death. His earlship is primarily notable in that it is never recorded that he ever fought with the Scots or the Britons of Strathclyde, who were usually constantly threatening Northumbria. Eirík is not mentioned in English documents after 1023. According to English sources, he was exiled by Canute and returned to Norway. This is very unlikely, as there are no Norse records of his supposed return. Eirik's successor as Earl, Sigurd, cannot be confirmed as being Earl of Northumbria until 1033, so Eirik's death cannot strictly be placed more precisely than between 1023 and 1033. According to the Norse sources, he died of a hemorrhage after having his uvula cut, a procedure in medieval medicine either just before or just after a pilgrimage to Rome. Religion. According to Theodoricus Monachus, Eirík pledged to adopt Christianity if he emerged victorious from the Battle of Svolder. Ottar Snorrason's Olaf's Saga Tryggvasonar has a more elaborate version of the story, where Eirík replaces an image of Thor on the prow of his ship with a Christian cross. There is no skaldic poetry to substantiate this, but most of the sagas agree that Eirík and Svein adopted Christianity, at least formally. Fagiskinna says, "These jarls had had themselves baptized and remained Christian, but they forced no man to Christianity, but allowed each to do as he wished, and in their day Christianity was greatly harmed, so that throughout Uppland and in over Thrandheimer almost everything was heathen, though Christianity was maintained along the coast." Adopting Christianity was no doubt a politically advantageous move for the earls since they were allied with the Christian rulers of Sweden and Denmark. Instituting freedom of religion was also a shrewd political move after Olafur Tryggvason's violent missionary activity. Eirik's religious conviction as a Christian was probably not strong. While the court poets of Eirik's rivals, Olafur Tryggvason and Olafur Haraldsson, censored heathen kennings from their poetry and praised their lord as a Christian ruler, all surviving court poetry devoted to Eirík is entirely traditional. The Bandadrapa, composed sometime after 1000, is explicitly pagan. Its refrain says that Eirík conquers lands according to the will of the heathen gods. Even the poetry of Þórður Kolbeinsson, composed no earlier than 1016, has no indication of Christian influence. According to Historia Norwegiae and Agrip, Eiríkr actively worked to uproot Christianity in Norway. This is not corroborated by other sources. Works that mention Eirík. The most important historical sources on Eirík are the 12th and 13th century kings' sagas, including the Heimskringla Fageskina Agrip, Nitlinga Saga, Historia Norvegiae, the legendary saga of Saint Olaf, and the works of Ottar Snorrason and Theodoricus Monachus. The Anglo-Saxon sources are scant but valuable as they represent contemporary evidence. The most important are the 11th century Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the Encomium Emmi, but Eirík is also mentioned by the 12th century historians Florence of Worcester, William of Malmesbury, and Henry of Huntingdon. A significant amount of poetry by Eirik's skalds is preserved in the king's sagas and represents contemporary evidence. The most important are the Bandadrapa of Eyjolfur Dadaskald and the works of Halldór Akristni and Þórður Kolbeinsson. Other skalds known to have composed on Eirík are Hallfredr Vandri Daskald, Gunnlaugur Ormstunga, Etrafn Anandarsson, Skili Thorsteinsson, and Þórður Esbjergsson.